So we're talking about the creation of the first real global economy, and these new connections and interactions generated a lot of wealth, moved products around the world, and really did increase the standard of living for lots of people. But at the same time, creating the global economy created some pretty horrific situations for lots of people. Silver mines in Bolivia, slaughtering of indigenous people by the Dutch in Indonesia, Spanish conquest of the Philippines, the negative impacts of the fur trade, the spreading of diseases around the world. But maybe the most right-in-your-face horrific situation was the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. And the Atlantic slave trade lasted for about 400 years from the 1400s to the 1800s. And during that time, 11 million people were shipped from Africa around the world. Most of these slaves were sent to the Americas, and it's impossible to understate how tragic the slave trade was for not only the people sold into slavery, but their families as well. So the institution of slavery itself was nothing new. Pretty much all the earlier civilizations had it in some form. Egypt, Mesopotamia, classical Greece, Rome, the Byzantines, the Caliphates, China. Slavery was a part of all these civilizations. In America, slavery was based on the plantation model. Before the Crusades, Europeans had really no knowledge of sugar, and Europeans learned about sugar, and Europeans built sugar plantations in West Africa, but before that, the Mediterranean. So initially, Europeans relied heavily on Slavic people as slaves, and they got these people from around the Black Sea area, and they worked in Mediterranean sugar plantations. When the Ottoman Empire took control of Constantinople in 1453, this cut the supply line of slaves off, so Europe had to turn their attention elsewhere for slave labor, and they looked upon Africa for their slave labor. A lot of the indigenous Americans had died because of disease. Slavic people were no longer available because the Ottoman Empire had cut them off. Africans were good farmers. They were immune to both tropical diseases and European diseases. They weren't Christians, and they were relatively nearby. So from the perspective at that time, they would make good slaves for sugar plantations. Along the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese were the main European power, and initially the Portuguese merchants tried to break into Africa and do slave raids on their own. These raids didn't work out very well because West Africans were fairly powerful, they had firearms and technologically advanced weapons, but also because Europeans didn't have immunities to tropical diseases. So, while European diseases killed indigenous people in America, tropical diseases such as malaria killed Europeans in Africa. But what the Europeans found was that there were plenty of powerful Africans who were willing to sell slaves peacefully, so that seemed like a better option. Instead of venturing into the continent, the ships would park along the coast, and the crews would wait in their ships or in trading cities and wait for African merchants to bring slaves from the interior to trade. So at this point, Europe wasn't an imperial country in Africa. Europeans were trading with African authorities, but it was more or less on equal terms. In the early years of the Atlantic slave trade, the 1500s, it was relatively small scale. About 4,000 slaves a year were exported from Africa. By the 1600s, the British, Dutch, and French entered the slave trade, and the numbers jumped to about 10,000 slaves being exported per year. The 1700s were the high point. Specifically around the 1750s, there were approximately 60,000 people per year being taken from Africa to America. One question that comes up with the slave trade is, how could African people sell each other into slavery? Historical context is important here. We want to remember there are many different types of societies in Africa. There were some large kingdoms, but there are also lots of really small-scale communities. There definitely wasn't any sense of African identity or unified African identity. African authorities didn't sell people from their own communities, but they might sell people from other communities. So slaves were often prisoners of war, some were criminals, some were people that owed debts, and as the trade became more and more profitable, lots of people were just kidnapped during slave raids, taken right out of their communities, and sold into slavery. Most slaves were taken to Brazil and the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations, and this trip was known as the Middle Passage. And the journey across the Middle Passage was really horrible beyond description. You'll read an account from a freed slave who writes about the voyage in the primary documents. In terms of new interactions, the Atlantic slave trade really brought Africa into the interacting Atlantic world that connected the Americas with Europe and now Africa. And the slave trade really transformed both America and Africa. In America, millions of Africans were making new lives, and this created an African identity in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. So we have African cultural influence coming to America. In terms of African society, the slave trade didn't cause a population collapse like disease had on indigenous Americans, but arguments have been made that it did slow population growth in Africa. In 1600, 18% of the world's population lived in sub-Saharan Africa. This number fell to only 6% in 1900. So there wasn't a population collapse per se, but the sub-Saharan Africa wasn't expanding as rapidly. The population wasn't growing as rapidly as the rest of the world. Some African kings and merchants gained wealth from the slave trade, but it caused a lot of suffering, especially for vulnerable people that were living in small-scale communities that didn't have protection from the horrors of the slave trade. So in the early modern era, we begin to see the emergence of a global economy. We have sustained interaction happening between America, Europe, and Africa. This is known as the Columbian Exchange. We have a trade network across the Pacific Ocean connecting America to Asia. And we also have the fur trade bringing people from northern climates more into the global economy. The new economy increased the standard of living for lots of people, but there's a great deal of human suffering that went along with it. The economy was tied closely to slavery and the building of empires. Despite a new global economy, it would be misleading to say that things were basically the same at the end of the early modern era as they are now. So, for example, communication between England and India took 18 months in the 1700s. By the end of the 1800s, this would take an hour, and now this can happen instantly through email and text messaging. The biggest thing is that the economy is still pre-industrial in the early modern era, and that means that production is powered by humans and animal muscle, powered by wind, it can be powered by water. And if we look at world history in the broadest sense, we can make the argument that there are really only two major turning points in human history. The first is the agricultural revolution, which gradually turned people away from hunting and gathering towards farming. And the next is the Industrial Revolution, which is a game changer in every sense of the word, and which will be one of the major focuses of Unit 4. So this is the end of episode 18. Thank you for listening.